The scorching Kansas sun beat down mercilessly on Dodge City's main street as 12-year-old Eli Turner pressed his back against the weathered wooden wall of Chandler's general store. His stomach growled audibly, a constant reminder that he hadn't eaten in 2 days. The orphan boy's clothes hung loose on his thin frame, patched and repatched until they barely resembled their original form. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." Eli watched the townsfolk go about their business, calculating which ones might need help carrying packages or running errands. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the store, her arms full of fabric bolts, but she quickly averted her eyes when she spotted him. The banker, Samuel Duggan, walked past without so much as a glance, his polished boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk with an air of superiority that made Eli's jaw clench. Then Eli noticed him. A tall, weathered man in his mid-40s struggled to balance a heavy sack of flour against his chest while trying to grip a crate of canned goods with his remaining right hand. His left sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly at the shoulder. The man's face was etched with concentration and frustration as he attempted to navigate the store's front steps. This was Jack "Lefty" Malone, though Eli only knew him by reputation. The townsfolk whispered about the former ranch foreman who lived alone on a small spread outside town, keeping to himself and speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. Some said he'd lost his hand in a cattle drive accident. Others claimed it was a war injury. What everyone agreed on was that Jack Malone was a man best left alone. But Eli saw something different. He saw a man struggling with a burden too heavy to bear alone. "Mister," Eli called out, pushing himself off the wall. "You need some help with that?" Jack froze mid-step, his weathered face turning toward the boy with surprise. His gray eyes, sharp as winter steel, studied Eli for a long moment. Most folks in Dodge City crossed the street when they saw Jack coming, but here was this scrawny kid offering assistance. "I can manage," Jack replied gruffly, though the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. Eli stepped closer, noting the way Jack's right arm shook from the weight. "Looks like that flour sack's about to slip. I may not look like much, but I'm stronger than I appear. Been hauling water buckets since I was 8. Jack's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to charity, especially from children. But as the flour sack shifted dangerously in his grip, practicality won over pride. "All right, boy, but just to my wagon." Eli quickly relieved Jack of the flour sack, surprised by its weight, but determined not to show it. Together, they walked toward a battered wagon hitched to an old mare that had seen better days. "Name's Eli Turner," the boy said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Jack Malone," came the curt reply. As they reached the wagon, Eli carefully loaded the supplies into the back. Jack watched him work, noting the boy's careful movements and respectful handling of the goods. "You eatin' today, boy?" Jack asked suddenly. Eli's hand stilled on the flour sack. He considered lying, but something in Jack's tone suggested the man would see right through it. "No, sir. Not today." Jack studied the boy's thin frame, the hollow look in his eyes that spoke of more than just one missed meal. Against his better judgment, he found himself saying, "You know anything about ranch work?" "Some," Eli replied cautiously. "Helped out at the Miller place before they moved on." Jack nodded slowly. The Miller family had lost their farm to the bank 6 months ago. Samuel Duggan's doing, no doubt. "I got a small spread about 5 miles out. Nothing fancy, but it needs work. Fences need mending, stock needs tending. One-handed work ain't easy." Jack paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. "You willing to work for your meals and a few coins?" Eli's eyes widened. It had been months since anyone had offered him steady work, let alone meals. "Yes, sir. I'd be grateful for the chance." "Don't be grateful yet," Jack warned. "I ain't the easiest man to work for. Keep to myself for good reasons." As Jack climbed onto the wagon seat, Eli noticed something that made his blood run cold. Across the street, Samuel Duggan stood in the doorway of his bank, watching their interaction with intense interest. The banker's pale eyes were fixed on Eli with an expression the boy couldn't quite read, but it made his skin crawl. "Mr. Malone," Eli said quietly, "that banker's been watching us." Jack followed Eli's gaze and his face hardened. "Samuel Duggan's got his fingers in every pie in this town. Best you learn to stay clear of him." "Why's he watching us?" Jack's knuckles whitened as he gripped the reins. "Some men collect debts, boy. Others collect secrets. Duggan collects both." As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Tom Keller approached the wagon. The lawman was an honest sort, but he looked troubled. "Jack," the sheriff nodded. "Heard you were taking on help." "Word travels fast," Jack replied evenly. "Just be careful. There's been talk around town. Some folks think it's strange. You taking in strays." Eli felt his cheeks burn with shame, but Jack's voice cut through his embarrassment like a knife. "Since when is honest work strange, Tom? Boy needs a job, I need help. Seems simple enough." The sheriff's eyes softened. "I'm not the one asking questions, Jack. Just watch yourselves." As they rode out of town, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were following them. He glanced back to see Samuel Duggan still standing in his doorway, and something about the man's smile made Eli's stomach turn. "Mr. Malone," Eli ventured as they left Dodge City behind. "What did the sheriff mean about folks asking questions?" Jack was quiet for so long that Eli thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, the older man spoke, his voice barely audible over the wagon wheels. "Some secrets are better left buried, boy. But this town, it's got a long memory and a short temper for outsiders." "Are you an outsider?" Jack's laugh was bitter. "Son, I've been running from something for so long, I sometimes forget what home feels like." As the sun began to set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Eli felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He'd found work, and possibly a place to belong, but the shadows in Jack's past seemed to be reaching out to claim them both. The wagon creaked along the dusty road, carrying two lost souls toward an uncertain future. Behind them, Dodge City grew smaller, but Eli couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. What neither of them knew was that Samuel Duggan was already planning his next move, and that Eli's simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. 3 weeks had passed since Eli Turner began working at Jack Malone's ranch, and the boy had never felt more at home. The small spread was modest: a weathered cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and pastures that stretched toward the horizon. But it was more than Eli had ever dared to hope for. Jack had proven to be a fair, if demanding, employer. The man rose before dawn and expected Eli to do the same. Together they mended fences, tended to the small herd of cattle, and maintained the property with a determination that spoke of pride despite their circumstances. "Hand me that hammer," Jack called from his position near a broken fence post. Eli quickly complied, watching as Jack expertly drove nails with his one good hand. The man had adapted to his disability with remarkable skill, though Eli often caught glimpses of frustration when Jack thought no one was looking. "Mr. Malone," Eli said carefully, "can I ask you something?" Jack paused in his hammering. Over the past weeks, he'd grown accustomed to the boy's questions, though he didn't always answer them. "Shoot. That day we met, you said you'd been running from something. What did you mean?" Jack's face darkened, and for a moment Eli thought he'd overstepped. But then the older man set down his hammer and looked out across the prairie. "Every man's got regrets, boy. Some are small. Words you wish you hadn't said. Chances you didn't take. Others," Jack's voice trailed off, "others follow you like shadows, no matter how far you run." Before Eli could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A lone rider was approaching the ranch, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. As the figure drew closer, Eli could make out a woman in her 30s, dressed in traveling clothes, and riding with the confidence of someone accustomed to long journeys. Jack's face went white as recognition dawned. "Rebecca," he whispered. The woman dismounted near the cabin, her movements graceful despite the obvious fatigue of long travel. She had the same gray eyes as Jack, the same stubborn set to her jaw, but where Jack's face was weathered by years of outdoor work, hers bore the refinement of city living. "Hello, Jack," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of warmth and uncertainty. "What are you doing here, Becca?" Jack's tone was guarded, but Eli could hear the emotion beneath the surface. "I got your letter." "What letter?" "I haven't written to you in 5 years." Rebecca's brow furrowed. "The letter about the boy, about how you'd found family again." Jack and Eli exchanged confused glances. "I never sent any letter," Jack said slowly. A chill ran down Eli's spine. "Then who did?" Before Rebecca could answer, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one Eli recognized immediately. Samuel Duggan, the banker from Dodge City. The man rode with purpose, his pale eyes fixed on the small group gathered near the cabin. "Well, well," Duggan called as he approached. "Quite the family reunion we have here." Jack stepped protectively in front of Eli. "What do you want, Duggan?" The banker dismounted with theatrical flair, his expensive suit looking out of place in the rustic setting. "I'm here on business, of course. You see, I've been doing some research into property deeds, and I've discovered something quite interesting about this little ranch of yours." "The deed's legal and paid for," Jack said firmly. "Oh, I'm sure it is," Duggan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "But you see, there's been a question raised about the original owner, a man named William Turner." Eli's blood turned to ice. Turner was his last name, but he'd never known his father's first name. "Never heard of him," Jack lied, but his voice betrayed him. Duggan's smile widened. "Really? Because according to my records, William Turner was your partner in a cattle operation that went very, very wrong. The same operation that cost you your hand and your freedom." Rebecca gasped. "Jack, what is he talking about?" "It's complicated, Becca," Jack said quietly. "Oh, it's not complicated at all," Duggan interjected. "You see, Mrs. Malone, Rebecca Malone." "Ah, the sister. How convenient. You see, Mrs. Malone, your brother and William Turner were involved in what some might call cattle rustling. When things went bad, Turner disappeared, and your brother here took the blame. Lost his hand in the process, not in an accident, but as punishment from the real owners of those cattle." Eli felt the world spinning around him. "You're lying." "Am I, boy? Tell me, what do you know about your parents? About how they died?" "They died of fever," Eli whispered. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. "Did they?" Duggan pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Because according to this wanted poster, William Turner was shot and killed while fleeing from a cattle theft. His wife died shortly after, some say from grief. Others say from a broken heart knowing her husband was a thief." Jack's face was ashen. "Duggan, that's enough. But here's the interesting part," the banker continued, clearly enjoying himself. "The stolen cattle? They were mine. I was the one who hired the men to track down Turner and your brother. I was the one who ordered Turner's death." The silence that followed was deafening. Eli stared at Jack, his mind reeling with the implications. "You knew," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper. "You knew who I was." Jack's shoulders sagged. "I suspected. When you told me your name, when I saw your face. You looked just like your father." "And you said nothing?" Eli's voice rose with each word. "You let me work for you. Let me trust you, knowing you were there when my father died." "It wasn't like that," Jack pleaded. "I tried to save him. I tried to—" "You tried to save a thief," Duggan interrupted. "And now I'm here to collect what's owed to me. This ranch sits on land that was bought with stolen money. By rights, it belongs to me." Rebecca stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "You can't just take someone's home." "Oh, but I can. You see, I have the law on my side. Sheriff Keller is already on his way with the proper paperwork." As if summoned by his words, the sound of multiple horses approached. Sheriff Keller rode up with 2 deputies, his face grim with reluctance. "Jack," the sheriff said heavily, "I'm sorry. I've got a court order here. The ranch is being seized pending investigation into the original purchase." Eli felt his world crumbling around him. In the span of minutes, he'd learned that his father was a thief, that Jack had been keeping secrets from him, and that the only home he'd known in years was being taken away. "There's more," Duggan said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. You see, young Eli here is technically an orphan with no legal guardian. As a concerned citizen, I've petitioned the court to take custody of him. After all, he can't be left with a man of such questionable character. No, Jack said firmly. I'll take responsibility for him. I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, you're under arrest for your part in the cattle theft. Statute of limitations doesn't apply when new evidence comes to light. Sheriff Keller looked sick as he produced a pair of handcuffs. Jack Malone, you're under arrest for cattle rustling and conspiracy to commit theft. As the sheriff reluctantly cuffed Jack, Eli felt a rage building inside him unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This is all lies, he shouted. You're doing this because justice must be served, Duggan finished smoothly. Don't worry, boy. You'll be well cared for. I have plans for you. The way Duggan said it made Eli's skin crawl. There was something predatory in the man's eyes, something that spoke of hidden motives far beyond simple justice. As Jack was loaded into the sheriff's wagon, he caught Eli's eye. Remember what I taught you about the old oak tree, he said urgently. Remember the stories about buried treasure. Duggan's head snapped up at the words, his eyes narrowing with sudden interest. What treasure? He demanded. But Jack had already been driven away, leaving Eli alone with Rebecca, Duggan, and the terrible realization that his simple act of kindness had unleashed forces far more dangerous than he could have imagined. As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky blood red, Eli Turner faced the darkest moment of his young life. But in Jack's cryptic words about the oak tree, he sensed there was more to this story than anyone knew. The game was just beginning, and Eli was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost him. The Dodge City Jail was a cramped, sweltering box that reeked of unwashed bodies and despair. Jack Malone sat on the narrow cot in his cell, his remaining hand clenched into a fist as he stared at the barred window. 3 days had passed since his arrest, and each hour felt like an eternity. Sheriff Tom Keller approached the cell, his face heavy with regret. Jack, I brought you some food. Not hungry, Jack replied without looking up. You need to eat, and you need to tell me what really happened all those years ago. Jack finally turned to face his old friend. Tom Keller had been a deputy back then, young and eager to prove himself. Now, as sheriff, he carried the weight of difficult decisions. What's the point, Tom? Duggan's got his story, and he's got the power to make it stick. Because I know you, Jack. I've known you for 15 years. You're not a thief. Jack's laugh was bitter. Aren't I? You weren't there that night, Tom. You didn't see what I did. Then tell me. Jack was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with memories he'd tried to bury. Finally, he began to speak. William Turner was my best friend. We'd worked together for years, saved every penny to start our own ranch. We were honest men, Tom, but we were desperate. The drought of '81 had wiped us out, and we owed money to half the territory. Tom pulled up a chair, settling in to listen. Duggan came to us with a proposition. Said he had a herd that needed moving, quick and quiet. The money he offered would have solved all our problems. We should have known it was too good to be true. What happened? We took the job, moved the cattle like he asked. But when we got to the delivery point, there were armed men waiting for us. Duggan's men. Turns out the cattle weren't his to sell. They belonged to a big rancher up north. Duggan had stolen them and needed someone to take the blame. Jack's voice grew thick with emotion. They shot William first. Didn't even give him a chance to explain. I tried to fight them off, but he gestured to his missing arm. They took my hand as a warning to anyone else who might cross Samuel Duggan. Why didn't you come forward? Tell the law what really happened. With what proof? Duggan owned half the judges in the territory. William was dead. I was crippled, and Duggan had witnesses ready to swear we were the thieves. So I ran, changed my name, started over, thought I could leave it all behind. Tom leaned forward. Jack, if this is true, we can fight it. We can... With what? It's my word against his, and he's got the whole town believing his version. Meanwhile, across town, Eli Turner was discovering that life under Samuel Duggan's care was far from the charitable act the banker claimed it to be. Duggan had installed Eli in a small room above the bank, ostensibly for the boy's protection, but it felt more like a prison. You'll work in the bank. Duggan had announced on Eli's first day. "Filing papers, running errands. Consider it part of your education." But Eli quickly realized that Duggan's real interest wasn't in his welfare. The banker questioned him constantly about Jack, about the ranch, and especially about Jack's cryptic words regarding buried treasure. "Tell me again what he said about the oak tree," Duggan pressed for the 100th time. "I told you I don't know what he meant," Eli lied. The truth was, he remembered exactly what Jack had said, and he was beginning to understand its significance. During their weeks together at the ranch, Jack had told Eli stories about the old days, about hidden caches where cowboys would bury their savings. There was an ancient oak tree on the property, gnarled and massive, that Jack had mentioned several times. Now Eli realized those weren't just stories, they were clues. That evening, as Duggan worked late in his office below, Eli made his decision. He slipped out of his room and made his way through the darkened streets of Dodge City. The moon was new, providing perfect cover for his escape. The 5-mile journey to the ranch felt like 50 in the darkness, but Eli pressed on, driven by a desperate need to uncover the truth. When he finally reached the property, he was surprised to find Rebecca Malone sitting by the old oak tree, a lantern at her feet. "I wondered when you'd come," she said softly. "Mrs. Malone, what are you doing here?" "The same thing you are, I suspect, looking for answers." She gestured to the massive tree. "Jack used to bring me here when we were children. He said this tree held secrets." Eli approached cautiously. "You believe him? About the treasure?" "I believe my brother is a good man who's been carrying a terrible burden. And I believe Samuel Duggan is a liar and a murderer." Together they began to search around the base of the tree. It was Rebecca who found it, a metal box buried beneath the roots, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the elements. Inside the box were documents that would change everything. Letters in Duggan's handwriting detailing the cattle theft scheme, receipts showing payments to the men who killed William Turner, and most damning of all, a confession written by one of Duggan's hired guns before his death. "This proves Jack was telling the truth," Rebecca breathed. "It proves more than that," Eli said, his voice shaking with emotion. "It proves Duggan killed my father." But their triumph was short-lived. The sound of approaching horses filled the night air, and soon they were surrounded by Duggan and several armed men. "Well, well," Duggan said, dismounting with predatory grace. "The orphan and the sister playing detective. How touching." "We know the truth," Rebecca said defiantly, clutching the box to her chest. "Do you? And what truth is that?" "That you're a murderer and a thief," Eli spat. Duggan's laugh was cold. "Prove it." "We have proof," Rebecca said, holding up the documents. "Had proof," Duggan corrected, signaling to his men. "Unfortunately, evidence has a way of disappearing." One of the gunmen stepped forward, but before he could act, a new voice cut through the night. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Sheriff Keller emerged from the shadows, his gun drawn and pointed at Duggan. Behind him came Jack Malone, no longer in shackles. "Tom," Duggan's composure slipped for the first time. "What are you doing here?" "My job," the sheriff replied grimly. "Seems I've been investigating the wrong man all these years." Jack stepped into the lantern light, his face hard as granite. "It's over, Duggan. Tom found the real witnesses. Men you thought were dead. Men who were willing to talk about what really happened that night." Duggan's hand moved toward his gun, but Sheriff Keller was faster. "Don't even think about it, Samuel. You're under arrest for murder, cattle theft, and conspiracy." As Duggan was led away in handcuffs, he turned back to Eli with pure hatred in his eyes. "This isn't over, boy. You have no idea what you've started." But Eli wasn't listening. He was looking at Jack, seeing the man who had risked everything to protect him, who had carried the burden of his father's death for 5 long years. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning." "You were protecting me," Eli replied, "just like you tried to protect my father." Rebecca stepped forward, the box of evidence still in her hands. "What happens now?" Sheriff Keller holstered his weapon. "Now we make sure justice is finally served. And Jack, your ranch is yours again." The court order was based on false evidence. As the sun began to rise over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, three unlikely allies stood together beneath the ancient oak tree. They had faced the shadows of the past and emerged into the light of truth. But even as they celebrated their victory, none of them noticed the figure watching from the distant hills, one of Duggan's men who had escaped the sheriff's net. The banker's final words echoed in the morning air. "This isn't over." The game had taken an unexpected turn, but the final move had yet to be played. 6 months had passed since Samuel Duggan's arrest, and life at the Malone Ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. Eli Turner had grown 3 inches and put on much-needed weight, his hollow cheeks filling out under Rebecca's careful attention to proper meals, and Jack's insistence on hard, honest work. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Rebecca prepared breakfast, humming softly to herself. She had decided to stay in Kansas, at least for now, finding purpose in helping to rebuild the life that Duggan had tried to destroy. "Eli!" Jack called from outside. "These fence posts won't set themselves." "Coming, Mr. Malone," Eli replied, though he'd taken to calling Jack by his first name in private moments. The boy had flourished under Jack's guidance, learning not just ranch work but the values of integrity and perseverance that had sustained Jack through his darkest years. In return, Eli's presence had awakened something in Jack that he thought he'd lost forever, the ability to hope. But their hard-won peace was about to be tested. Sheriff Tom Keller rode up to the ranch house, his face grim with news that would change everything once again. "Jack! Rebecca! Eli!" he called, dismounting near the porch. "We need to talk." The three gathered around the kitchen table as Tom removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "Duggan escaped," he said without preamble. The words hit like a physical blow. Jack's face hardened, while Rebecca gasped and reached protectively for Eli. "How?" Jack demanded. "Had help from the inside. Deputy Morrison was found unconscious in his cell. When he came to, Duggan was gone, along with 3 other prisoners." Eli felt his stomach turn to ice. "Where is he now?" "That's the problem. We don't know, but we found this nailed to the courthouse door this morning." Tom handed them a piece of paper with words scrawled in Duggan's distinctive handwriting. "The boy knows too much. Some debts can only be paid in blood." "He's coming for me," Eli whispered. "Like hell he is," Jack said fiercely. "We'll be ready for him." But Rebecca shook her head. "Jack, we can't fight him here, not with Eli in danger." "I'm not running again," Jack declared. "I've spent 5 years running from this man's shadow. It ends here." Tom leaned forward. "There's something else. We intercepted a telegram. Duggan's been in contact with some unsavory characters from back east, professional killers. They're already on their way to Dodge City." The weight of the situation settled over them like a shroud. This wasn't just about Samuel Duggan anymore. It was about survival. "What do we do?" Eli asked, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. Jack stood and walked to the window, staring out at the land he'd fought so hard to keep. "We make our stand, but first, we need to level the playing field." That evening, as darkness fell over the prairie, Jack revealed a secret he'd kept even from Eli. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the barn was a cache of weapons, rifles, ammunition, and dynamite left over from his days as a ranch foreman. "I always knew this day might come," he explained as they prepared their defenses. "Duggan's not the type to let things go." Rebecca proved to be surprisingly capable with a rifle, a skill she'd learned growing up on their father's ranch before moving east. "I may have lived in the city," she said, checking her weapon, "but I haven't forgotten how to shoot." As they worked through the night, fortifying the ranch house and setting up defensive positions, Eli couldn't help but marvel at how much his life had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a starving orphan with no hope for the future. Now he was part of a family willing to fight and die for each other. The attack came at dawn. Eli was the first to spot them, 6 riders approaching from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. Duggan rode in the center, his pale eyes fixed on the ranch house with murderous intent. "They're here," Eli called softly. Jack took position at the front window while Rebecca covered the back. Eli, despite their protests, insisted on helping. positioning himself where he could reload weapons and watch for flanking movements. The riders stopped just outside rifle range, and Duggan's voice carried across the morning air. "Jack Malone, send out the boy, and the rest of you can live." Jack's response was to fire a warning shot that kicked up dust near Duggan's horse. "I'll take that as a no," Duggan called back. He turned to his men. "Burn them out." What followed was a battle that would be talked about in Dodge City for years to come. Duggan's hired guns were professionals, but they hadn't counted on the determination of people fighting for their family. Jack's military experience showed as he directed their defense, using the ranch's layout to their advantage. Rebecca's shooting proved deadly accurate, dropping one of the attackers before they could reach the house. But it was Eli who turned the tide of battle. As the gunfight raged, he noticed one of Duggan's men circling toward the barn, carrying what looked like a torch. If the barn caught fire, it would spread to the house, and they'd be forced into the open. Without thinking, Eli slipped out the back door and made his way toward the barn. He reached it just as the gunman was about to set it ablaze. "Hey!" Eli shouted. The man spun around, gun in hand, but Eli was ready. He'd learned more than just ranch work from Jack. He'd learned how to fight for what mattered. The struggle was brief, but fierce. When it was over, the gunman lay unconscious, and Eli had prevented the fire that would have doomed them all. But the victory came at a cost. In the confusion, Duggan had managed to get closer to the house than anyone realized. "Eli!" Rebecca screamed as the banker appeared in the kitchen doorway, gun drawn. Time seemed to slow as Duggan raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Jack appeared behind him, moving with surprising speed for a one-handed man. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the gun. Duggan was younger and had both hands, but Jack fought with the fury of a man protecting his family. The gun went off. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Duggan's body went limp, and Jack struggled to his feet, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. "It's over," he said simply. Sheriff Keller arrived an hour later with a posse, drawn by the sound of gunfire. By then, the surviving members of Duggan's gang had been rounded up, and the banker himself lay dead in the kitchen where he'd made his final fatal mistake. As the wounded were tended to and the dead were removed, Eli found himself standing once again beneath the old oak tree, this time with Jack and Rebecca beside him. "What happens now?" he asked. Jack put his good arm around the boy's shoulders. "Now we live. We work the land, we take care of each other, and we remember that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice." Rebecca smiled through her tears. "I've been thinking about staying permanently. This place could use a woman's touch. And a teacher," Jack added. "Eli's got a good mind. He deserves a proper education." As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, three people who had found each other against all odds stood together, planning their future. Eli Turner was no longer an orphan. Jack Malone was no longer running from his past. And Rebecca Malone had found a purpose she'd never known she was looking for. The old oak tree stood sentinel over them, its ancient branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in benediction. Beneath its shade, a new family had been born. Not from blood, but from choice, courage, and the simple act of one boy offering to help a stranger carry his groceries. In the distance, Dodge City continued its bustling existence, unaware that in a small ranch house 5 miles away, 3 people had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground. They're found in the hearts of those brave enough to open them to love. The story that had begun with a simple act of kindness had ended with the creation of something far more valuable than gold, a family bound not by obligation, but by choice, love, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eli Turner, no longer alone, no longer afraid, looked up at the vast expanse above and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, and new opportunities to prove that kindness, courage, and family could overcome any obstacle. The orphan had found his home. The lonely cowboy had found his purpose, and together, they had discovered that the greatest victory of all was simply learning how to love and be loved in return. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.